Making a multiple piece cut block mold using platinum silicone. In today's tutorial, we're going to cover the process of making what is called a cut block mold, following a little bit more complicated parting line than some of our previous molds that we've done. You might have seen this on our Instagram page. If you don't follow us, be sure to check us out at Bitty Mold Supply. In this tutorial, we'll be molding this little plastic horse, and I chose this particular pattern because it presents some very specific parting line problems of having a weird parting line to follow those hooves. Typically, a standing figure like a human is fairly straightforward, but when you have a four-legged animal like this, sometimes you have to make a little bit more creative parting line. So this one is going to follow the pattern of kind of a shallow U shape if you were to stand it up on edge. So we're going to go from up to the right back leg, over to the left, up to the left front leg, back over to the right, and then straight forward. And we're going to part that, as you can see from that little translucent gray plane there, we're going to part that so that the horse's head is actually a little bit to the right of that parting line so that it winds up just being on its own separate part of the mold. And that ensures that we don't have any seams right on the horse's face or on its head. Now, if we wanted to, we could make this a little bit more complicated and add a sprue up to the horse's chin. But I wanted to keep this tutorial fairly simple and just mainly discuss that parting line following that halfway point across the hooves and down the back of the horse. Now, there's a lot of ways we can build our mold box for a part like this, but because of the scale of this and for ease of use, we're going with foam core board. And you can find this at any office supply store. It's easy to cut with a razor knife, easy to measure out the shapes that you need, and it doesn't require any special tools like a table saw or a skill saw or anything like that. And you can just score it and then break it on those lines. So here we've spaced it out to make sure it's the right width and height to go about a ½ inch around our horse and at least an inch or so over the top. And once we've defined that shape, we're ready to anchor our horse to the baseboard. And here again we're using hot glue, and we'll also be using that to secure that box. And one of the reasons we're using hot glue versus any other adhesive for this is hot glue is vinyl, and when it cools off it's inert, so it doesn't release any contaminants that could harm the silicone and affect that cure later on. As I said in the intro, this will be a platinum silicone mold, and we don't want anything that could inhibit the cure of the platinum silicone later on. Now, once we've got that in place and secured to the board, and again, real important to secure that because if it were to move during the mold making process, that could ruin our mold, and especially if this is a low density part, it could float. So real important to secure your part. But once we've done that, we're going to take a pen and draw out the parting line that we're going to follow here. And you'll see now a little bit more clearly where that goes, that again, that kind of that shallow U shape that we're going to define. I decided here to go ahead and follow the back left hoof and then jog over to the right and then up to the right front hoof and over to the left and forward. And once we've got that defined, we're ready to release our pattern. Now here, I'm just spraying a little bit of ejected 33 on our horse, not too much on the baseboard because I still need to glue that down, but I want to make sure we got the belly of the horse really good with release before we sealed up our mold box. And now ready to hot glue our mold box shut. And this is a hot rod glue gun that we got from Uline. If you do a lot of mold making in this style of mold making, a good glue gun is a very good investment. This is a great way to also cauterize leaks in silicone. Since platinum silicone is heat cured, having that hot glue gun around, you can instantly stop leaks with that heat if need be. And we're going to seal the base of that really good all the way around the outside. Real important here. Again, hot glue is great because it seals without putting off any contaminants that could mess up your silicone. If you were to use something like a silicone sealant, that could release acids that might inhibit the cure of your platinum silicone. So real important, make sure you seal that up really well and make sure everything you're using will not affect the cure of platinum silicone. Now, once we've got that anchored in place, I'm going to take a little added precaution so I can find those lines later on, and I'm going to draw the parting line where I'm going to need it to be on the mold box. And that way I'll be able to transfer that line to the rubber later on, because since this is going to be cast in an opaque rubber, we're going to be molding this using an opaque silicone, our P525 silicone, and we won't be able to see into it at all. So real important that we're able to remember where those parting lines are later so we can cut open this block mold accurately. And now ready to spray the mold box with release and calculate the volume of our mold box to figure out how much rubber we're going to need to fill that box. So the dimensions for this is a pretty simple volume calculation. We want to figure out our cubic inch dimensions, so we're going to take the length of the box times the width times the height. And once we get that, that will give us our cubic inch volume of that mold box. Now, if you want, a simpler way to do this is also to use dry rice, to just pour the dry rice in and pour it back out into a graduated container. But the weight is always going to give you a much more precise estimate of how many pounds of silicone you need. So here we took the length of the box, 6 inches, times the width, 3 inches, times the height, 4.5, and that gave us 81 cubic inches of volume. Now, if we take that and divide that by the density of the silicone, which in this case is about 25 cubic inches per pound, that gives us 3.24 pounds of silicone. And you can find that number on all of our data sheets for all of our silicone products. So look for that cubic inch density per pound and take that number and divide it. You'll find the denser silicones will be like 23 or 24 cubic inches per pound, and the lower density silicones are going to be more like 25 or 26 cubic inches per pound. Now for this block mold, we wanted a silicone that's inexpensive and simple and fast, and we wanted something that didn't need to be vacuum degassed. So here we're using the P525 platinum silicone. This is a low viscosity system, so it doesn't have to be vacuum degassed unless you're going to be pressure casting. This is a Shore A25, so it's medium softness, not so soft that it would distort when it's clamped back together. And it has about a 15-minute pour time at 70 degrees and a 3 to 4 hour demold. So it's a relatively fast silicone, especially in the summertime. We could demold something pretty quick. And of course, 1-to-1 mix ratio, so very easy to mix and measure out. And of course, it's inexpensive. So this is a great kind of a starter silicone for those of you getting started with resin casting. So since our calculations showed that this is going to take about 3.24 pounds, we're going to use 2 of the 2-pound kits because it's going to take a little bit less than 4 pounds total. So we're going to work with 2 2-pound kits, or you could also work out of a 16-pound kit. But real important, this is why I recommend that you do the math on your mold box before you start any of your purchasing process of buying the supplies, because one of the worst things is to assume that it's going to take only 2 pounds, and once you get everything in, you realize that you've actually got a mold box that's going to take about a half a gallon. So be sure to do the math and make sure you check all that out before you start buying materials, and that will save you a lot of sadness. Now here we're measuring out our base rubber first. You'll notice that the P525 is labeled a little bit different than some of our other products. The 525 has a silicone base rubber and a catalyst rather than a part A and B. So here we're going to dispense the base rubber, the part, what would typically be the part B, and pour that into our mixing container. And here we're using about 700 grams of the base rubber. And then again, since this is a 1-to-1 mix ratio, by weight, we'll be measuring out 700 grams of the catalyst. Now, I haven't checked to see typically if these are about the same specific gravity. Sometimes you can do the mix ratio by weight or volume, but right now I typically just do this one by weight. It's much easier to do it by weight, and you'll see that you only mess up one container like this, mixing and measuring all in one container. And if you're careful by mixing that all together, and if you stir it carefully and make sure everything's incorporated into the mixture, then you can easily peel that out later on and reuse that mixing cup. So real important, if at all possible, mix and measure in the same container, and it will make your life infinitely easier. That does, of course, require an accurate gram scale, and you do have to be very careful to make sure that you're measuring as accurately as possible. Now, once we have everything measured out into our mixing cup, remember that the clock starts ticking as soon as those chemicals go together. Remember, the silicone is stupid. It does not know what you want to do with it. So as soon as you put those two parts together, the clock starts ticking. And that includes mixing, pouring time, everything. So you need to get your material mixed and poured within about 10 minutes, ideally. You want to have time left over to make sure that any air bubbles that are trapped inside have time to move up to the surface. So don't mess around here. As soon as you get the two parts together, stir those together, and you'll see that I'm taking extra care to scrape the sides and the bottom of the mixing cup and really work that together until there's no little colored lines, no striations that give away that we have some unmixed material. And that doesn't take very long. That only takes about 30 to 45 seconds with this particular silicone. It's very easy to mix it together. Now here, even though I'm not vacuum degassing, I still want to take care to avoid air bubbles. So I'm going to fill up that mold box about halfway, and then I'm going to tilt it side to side to help dislodge any air bubbles that might be on the underside of that horse. Because even though, again, this is a low viscosity silicone, and you'll see later on we have a nice bubble-free mold in the final result, still we could risk trapping an air bubble on the underside that just can't physically move around the horse. So take time to tilt that side to side when necessary, and be aware of where your problem areas might be. Again, for this, it's going to be on the chin of the horse and on the underside. So take care to move that side to side and tilt it back and forth if necessary to allow any air bubbles to come to the surface. And a lot of that is going to come with experience of knowing where air bubbles might get trapped. So be aware of that going into this, that you will get better the more of these kinds of molds you make, of being able to spot those problem areas before you start, because each part will be slightly different. Now we've got our silicone poured. Now the next thing we need to do is just check that seal, because if anything is going to leak, it's going to be at the base of this mold where the foam core meets that baseboard. So take a minute to look around that mold box, make sure there's no silicone leaking out, because right now is the time to fix that with your hot glue gun. You can easily add some more hot glue, seal that right up, and then move along. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's real important to remember where our parting line needs to be. So one thing I want to keep track of is where the head and the tail are. And again, we'll transfer those lines to that finished block mold. So now ready to let that sit and cure for about 3 to 4 hours. Remember, hot temperature accelerates the cure, cold temperature slows it down. And a great way to grade your work is to peel out what's left over in the mixing container. Always keep that handy. Don't throw that away, because that's a great way to check and make sure everything is cured before you start opening your mold. If you open your mold, for instance, and you have a big gooey mess where the silicone didn't cure up against your part, but you find that what's in the mixing container has cured fine, then that tells you your pattern had some kind of contaminant on it that inhibited the silicone. So that's a great way to figure out exactly where your problems are, and that eliminates the need for needless troubleshooting later on. So now ready to tear open our mold box, and you'll notice that I took the time there really quick to mark on the baseboard where that parting line needs to go. And that way I can make sure that I keep track of that throughout this whole process and know where to cut this open. Now, it's not the end of the world. If I forget where exactly those parting lines go, it's not going to be the death of this mold, but it will make it more complicated to remember exactly where I need to make that cut. And especially when you're starting out with this type of mold, you don't want to go in with an exact or a scalpel fishing for the part. You wind up with a lot of needless cuts that don't need to be on your mold. So make sure you mark it well and keep track of where exactly that parting line needs to be, and it'll make your cutting later on much easier. So again, here I'm marking where the head and the tail are, just so I can keep those straight. And now I'm ready to cut open my mold. Now, one of the tricks here that's real important for this method we're going to use is I'm only going to cut into the mold about a little over a ½ inch. And you'll see I'm going to use this kind of an S pattern, almost like a zipper, all around my part. And the only places where I'm going to make a straight cut is down here around the legs, mainly because there's not enough room to make that little S pattern. So what I'm going to do is first go all around the part, just like I'm opening, almost like I'm cutting it in half partially, just sticking about a ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch of the scalpel into that, making that S curve all the way around the mold. Now you'll notice I have both a scalpel and a razor knife or an X-Acto knife handy here. And I've found that both work well for this. Scalpels are really sharp, but remember, cutting implements like this are stupid. They do not know the difference between silicone and human flesh. So if you are operating a sharp instrument, respect it as the cutting tool that it is. Now again, I'm just making that little S-curve all the way around the part, all the way up to that leading hoof and the back tail, and then all the way around the top. And I'm only going into the mold right around a ½ inch. So my scalpel, unless I'm right up against the leg or the tail, is not coming in contact with the pattern at this point. Now, once I've done that, once I've established that zipper cut all the way around the part, now I'm ready to pry it open and cut the rest of the way. And that cut will be essentially straight, not exactly straight, because I'm gonna have to move around a little bit to get it exactly there to the part. But that we don't need to be keyed. We just need that outside edge to have those kind of like teeth that key back together later on. So now I'm just making that straight cut between the hooves. And now I'm ready to have Patrick step in and help me hold it open. Can't stress enough, if you're new to doing this, or even if you've been doing this 40, 50 years, it really helps to have somebody helping you open that mold to cut it open. Because if you try to do this by yourself, that's a great way to cut yourself very badly. And real helpful to have somebody also who understands the process and knows how to pull that mold open and knows exactly what you're doing. Because again, you're working with a sharp instrument and you don't want either of you to get cut. So here you'll see Patrick is prying that open, and he knows the routine here, so he pries that open just ahead of where I'm cutting. And I'm going to link some other videos in the at the end of this, so be sure to check those out. I'm going to link another block mold at the end of this video, so you can check that out if you want to see more examples of how we cut open block molds like this. And also, remember, if you're new to our channel and new to our store, all the products we use in our videos are on our website. So be sure to check the video description. I'll have links to all the products we're using in this video. And again, I'll have a playlist that I'll link to as well in the video description, so be sure to check that out as well. That playlist is on our website and covers a lot of more extensive poured mold applications. So be sure to check that out as well. But take your time doing this process of demolding like this, because if you rush this and you start prying on the mold too much, it's easy to rip the mold or cut it someplace where it can't be put back together, and you never want to try to glue a cut like this back together. So take your time and make accurate cuts and very carefully open up your mold, and you'll get very good results that'll give you a good, tough mold that'll hold up well in production. Now, as I mentioned earlier, real important that you do this particular technique with silicone that's no softer than about an A20. If you get too soft on your silicone with this type of mold, it will distort when you clamp the two halves back together. So real important, I typically like to use something an A20 or higher. In this case, the 525 is a 25 Shore A, so it's ideal for this. But remember, go too soft on this and you'll wind up with distortions in your final part. And now we have our finished two-piece block mold. And this is a simple cut block mold. If need be, we could make more pieces. Just remember, if you do have to cut multiple pieces, you always have to think about how you're going to reassemble and secure those pieces later on. So there's no right or wrong way as long as you get a good part out of the mold. If it takes a 3, 4, 5, or 10-piece mold, just as long as you can secure all of that back together, that's the key. Now, speaking of securing the mold back together, we're going to cut up some little boards. This is a little scrap piece of plywood that I had sitting around the shop. We're going to cut this up to make some little brackets to hold the mold together. And this will just function like little bookends that will secure around our mold. I just cut those up on a chop saw. And now I can put those around my block mold and very carefully strap that together. Now, if you're using a tension strap like this, obviously you can use rubber bands on a mold this size, but a tension strap works really good, or a mold strap like this works great. But avoid those ratchet straps like you get at hardware stores, because those will way over tighten the mold and almost always result in distortion. So be really careful to just use a tension strap like this. This is a mold strap that's we sell on our website. They're cheap, they're easy to use, and just exerts just enough force to seal the mold shut, and not so much that you wind up clamping it to where it distorts. And if it distorts, it's probably also going to leak. So once that's secured, we can check the top of our mold for any other little dangly bits of silicone. And once those are removed, we're ready to do our first test part. Now, it's important to remember that your first part out of a mold like this will be your chance to learn the mold and understand where problem areas might exist, which areas might be prone to trapping air bubbles. Now, here we're going to cast this up in our basic polyurethane resin. This is EasyFlow 60, and I know roughly this is going to take probably around 4 or 5 ounces, so I'm mixing a little bit more than I need. I'm doing 3 ounces of part A and 3 ounces of part B by volume. EasyFlow 60 is a very simple resin system that gives you about 2.5 minutes working time and demolds in about 15 minutes at room temperature. And real important, you don't want to spend too long mixing. Mix accurately and thoroughly. You'll notice that it only takes me about 12 to 15 seconds to mix up that A and B, and then it pours like water. So you don't want to spend too much time stirring, or you'll feel it start building up heat and it'll start to set up in the container. So make sure to get that low viscosity. You want to mix it and pour it as soon as possible. If you wait until the material starts to heat up, it's too late, and that could result in it pouring and being thicker and trapping a lot of air bubbles, or even worse than that, setting up while you're pouring it, and then you waste valuable resin. Now, the main area that I was concerned about that might trap air on this particular part was the head. So I put the head at one end and then filled it up about 3/4 of the way full, and then poured some of that back out. And that way I could shake it a little bit while I was doing that and hopefully dislodge any air bubbles in the ears or in the nose. And then I filled it up the rest of the way. And again, remember, this is a test part to just see how our mold pours and see where it might want to trap air bubbles. So once I've done that, I've topped off the hooves with any extra resin, and now I can use what's left over to judge exactly how much resin this took. And you'll see that based on what's left over, it took almost exactly 3 ounces of resin. So on our next batch, we don't have to mix up quite as much. So remember, that first time you pour might use up a little bit more resin than you want to, but that's a great way to make sure that you know from that point on exactly how much it's going to take to fill the mold. Now remember, the EasyFlow 60 is a polyurethane resin that cures from the thickest mass and radiates out. So you'll notice that the thick areas cure first and the thin areas cure last. So the little drips up at the top of the mold, those are the last places to solidify. And that's important to remember, because if you're pouring something statuary with thin hands and fingertips, remember those will be the last places to cure. So if the thinnest spot at the top of the mold has not cured completely, don't touch it yet. Make sure everything is solid before you start opening the mold. And now this is about 20 to 30 minutes later and ready to demold our part. And one of the nice things about EasyFlow 60, this cures to a 65 Shore D. And what that means is it's a hard plastic, but it still has a little bit of give to it. And that's really important if you're doing parts that are going to be handled a lot that you don't want shattering if they're dropped. Because EasyFlow 60 is going to bend a little bit before it breaks, which gives it really good impact resistance. And now ready to use our razor knife again to clean up our part. And now we have our finished cast horse part. And other than a little air bubble in the tip of the snout of the horse, kind of the underside of his little chin, other than that, we have a nice bubble-free part. And now that we know where the bubbles might be prone to occur, we're ready to cast the next parts. We're taking more care to tip that mold a little farther towards the head and carefully burp those bubbles out of the mold. So there you have the process of making a basic two-piece cut block mold and resin cast using P525 silicone and Easy Flow 60 casting resin. Now, as usual, be sure to check the video description for links to all of the products we use, and I'll also put links to some of the relevant playlists of videos that we have on our website. So be sure to check those out. And as always, you can find all the supplies we use in our videos on our website at brickintheyard.com. Thanks again for watching, and if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more mold making and casting content.